Hello everyone and welcome back to Encyclopaedia Bellatoria. This series is about Aosian heroes and villains, contemporary and historical, primals and monsters of legend, as well as the martial traditions of the realm. We will make a thorough account for these figures, their roles and impact in Aosia, their context throughout the Final Fantasy franchise, as well as their real-world, literary, mythological, or historical inspiration and background. By the end of the story for patch 3.3 of Heavensward, Revenge of the Horde, the Warrior of Light had confronted both of the Great Wyrms, Hraesvelgr and Nidhogg, in battle, and ostensibly concluded the story arc of the Dragonsong War. As such, I think this is the ideal time to take a retrospective look at these characters, Nidhogg, Hraesvelgr and Ratatoskr, and the relationship between them that came to shape the history of the realm. Without any particular conclusions, I would also like to speculate about the effect that their mythological namesakes could have had on the conception and the design of these three Great Wyrms, the dynamics of their association and interactions, and how some knowledge of the former might help us to greater appreciate and plumb the depths of the latter. As Midgard Zorma tells it, he settled on Hydaelyn when she was but a young star, carrying 7 eggs that would soon hatch and disseminate across the land, becoming over the millennia the 7 Great Wyrms of legend and unrivaled power. Of these 7, 3 made their homes in the north of Aosia: Hraesvelgr, Ratatoskr, and Nidhogg. Sometime around the 3rd or 4th century of the 6th Astral Era, as mortal memories of the not-so-distant War of the Magi and the Great Flood, which consumed the realm, began to fade, a wandering tribe of Elysian reached the green highlands of Kurthus, believing that they had discovered a land promised by their guiding deity, Halone the Fury. But the dragons were wary and saw these migrants as invaders. They would have known what happened to their siblings in Mericidia at the hands of the Allagans, and withdrawn from the reach of man ever since. The Elysian in turn mistook these great creatures for terrible and semi-intelligent beasts, but one mortal woman quelled the conflict through her bond with the great Hraesvelgr, becoming a venerated beacon and symbol for a united nation of the two races. But hubris and the coveting of power, ever the grand theme of Final Fantasy, eventually gripped the mortal Elysian king Thordan, when he learned of the incredible strength to be won at the possession of a Great Wyrm's eye, knowledge no doubt gained in the Council of Aosians. So he and his trusted lured and slaughtered Ratatoskr, consumed her eyes, invited the eternal rage and retribution of Nidhogg from below, whilst Hraesvelgr watched sadly on from above, his grief ostensibly only kept from igniting a similar fury by the blanketing spirit of Shiva. We're all familiar with the story of the Dragonsong War by now, but once we also understand the inspiration for these characters, it is hard to imagine that it could have been any other way. In the Norse tradition, Nidhogg is usually translated as corpse striker or mouse striker. Nid was a term for a man without honor, a villain or a cur, and Hogr is closest to striker. The Norse Nidhogg lies in Nastrond, the deepest pit of hell, and feeds on these nits: murderers, adulterers, oath-breakers, and cowards. This is how he's described in both of the Edicles, Grimnismal, and Voluspa. This concept corroborates perfectly with his role in Aosia and gives us a window into his conception and development as a character. Our Nidhogg takes it upon himself to be the terrible embodiment of retribution against the murderers and oath-breakers of Ishgard for all eternity. He is their hell, and he will consume them forever. But just as the Norse Nidhogg tears at the roots of Yggdrasil and Nastrond, so too does the fury of our Nidhogg eat away at the life of Hydaelyn. The other function of Nidhogg in Norse mythology, which he reflects in Aosia, comes from the final stanza of the Voluspa. Then comes the gloomy dragon flying, serpent from below, from Nidhogg, bears in feather corpse, flying over plain, Nidhogg now pale, now may she sink. At the advent of Ragnarok, Nidhogg flies over the land and the corpses of men rain down from his wings. These corpses are for us the body of his horde, the transformed Ishgardians which he sends to prey on their own children, wave after wave. Our Nidhogg is obviously diametrically opposed to the pacifism of Hraesvelgr in action, even if Hraesvelgr sympathizes with Nidhogg's fury and feels his own deep contempt for man. Well, Hraesvelgr and Nidhogg are just as much antitheses in the Norse cosmogony. There is only one direct reference to Hraesvelgr in Eddic poetry. Vafthrûdnir spake, in an eagle's guise at the end of heaven, Hraesvelgr sits, they say, and from his wings does the wind come forth to move over the world of men. This giant in eagle's form, Hraesvelgr, is usually presumed to be the same eagle as that which perches at the very top of the world Ash Yggdrasil, as far above our world as Nidhogg is below. There is, however, something that connects both of these figures to each other, and connects each to the mortal world of Midgard. This is the critical role of Ratatoskr. Ratatoskr is the squirrel named, run on Yggdrasil's ash, words from above from eagle carry, and beneath to Nidhogg bring. Obviously, having Heavensward present Ratatoskr as a sibling to Nidhogg and Hraesvelgr means that her death causes them great pain, but it also severs their connection to one another and to Aosian. Nidhogg is the Avenger, thematically. He is repetitive action and perpetual violence incarnate, whilst Hraesvelgr is opposite, the lofty and apathetic observer, the ever-watching eagle. I believe that their proclivity for these archetypes would have been present even before the Dragonsong War for them to become so entrenched in them at its outset. Ratatoskr is, or was, the mediator, quelling the rage of Nidhogg and stirring the passion of Hraesvelgr, gently pulling them from their own extremes whilst presumably also carrying the discourse between each of them and the mortal Elysin. A great deal of credit is given to Saint Shiva, but I can imagine that the role of Ratatoskr was of equal importance to keeping the peace, and it was precisely this role that made her vulnerable and ultimately a target for betrayal. She was the closest to the mortals in her role, and also the most trusting, the innocent squirrel. I feel that there is a good measure of influence from the nature and role of these figures in the Norse cosmogony upon their representations in Aosian, and in turn upon the story of Heavensward and the Dragonsong War. In fact, I think that this single image from Eddic manuscript AM 73842, dated circa 1680, was likely a goldmine for the conception of this story. The dispensation for us is that a wealth of material can be won from even the slightest of illusions, and that the stories we love are made ever more fruitful when we explore the worlds that inspire them. So there is a brief retrospective on Hraesvelgr, Ratatoskr, and Nidhogg. I hope that it gets you thinking about these characters and the kind of history they may have shared in Aosian, and that perhaps you might even feel inspired to dive into the world of old Eddic poetry sometime. You would be astonished by how many familiar names and ideas you would find in the Völuspá alone. But that's all for the Encyclopaedia Bellatoria today. Like and subscribe for more. Check out the playlist for this series. Please feel free to leave any comments below if you'd like to discuss the material. But until next time, I'm Ethys, and thank you so much for watching.